And welcome to the first lecture of APUS history. We are going to start with the very first topic in the course and exam description, which is contextualizing period one. Period one runs from 1491 to 1607. So we are going to talk about everything that happened up until European contact, all the way through the very first English settlement at Jamestown in 1607. And so what the College Board wants us to know by the end of this topic is to be able to explain the context for European encounters in the Americas from 1491 to 1607. So let's get to it. The very first key concept that they want us to go over is key concept 1.1. It says, as native populations migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed distinct and increasingly complex societies by adapting to and transforming their diverse environment. So the very first part of that is the migration and the peopling of the Americas. And so the way in which they were able to do so is the very first is getting to the American continent, and that was through the Bering Land Bridge, which opened up about 35,000 years ago. The Ice Age lowered the sea level, which revealed some land connecting the Asian and the North American continent. People were able to continue that migration for the next 25,000 years. And on this map, you can see their trajectory. Now, in this map, you'll also see that there is a possible sea route that is outlined. All of that would have continued as well to the very southern tip of South America at Tierra del Fuego. As the population continued to come from Asia into North America, they splintered off and they created different cultures. And so by the end of the migration, you had thousands of different cultural and linguistic groups across North and South America. So anthropologists estimate that about 54 million people inhabited North and South America before Columbus stumbled upon the Bahamas in 1492. So, though they all came from the very same ancestry, these migrants, they crossed the Bering Land Bridge. As they splintered off, they created a diverse amount of groups. And so that's what Key Concepts 1.1 Roman numeral 1 says. So different native societies adapted to and transformed their environments through innovations in agriculture, resource use, and social structures. And so the way in which they adapted to their environments and the geographies in which they settled really helped form the differences in all of the different groups. And so here you see just North America, all the different large language and cultural groups across what is now the United States. And even within these groups, you would have many differences. So within a tribe, you would have bands, and within those bands, you have different kinship groups, and you would have even linguistic differences amongst some of the larger tribes. And like the key concept said, so some of the innovations that they came up with was agriculture. So most adopted to some form of agriculture. Sometimes they would supplement the agriculture that they would have with hunting. Some might be migratory, so they would plant food in some areas and then migrate, let the soil regain its nutrients, and then come back in a different season or in a different year. The Three Sisters farming, the three crops that were most important here were corn, squash, and beans. And as you can see on the picture here, they all kind of grew together in the same area. The squash would grow closer to the ground, the corn would grow in its stalk, and then you would also have vines of beans dangling here, as you can see in a tiny little way, from the corn stalks. Now, Three Sisters farming is not just important because it's how people fed themselves, but the food, the corn, the squash, the beans that came from Three Sisters farming were also very nutritious foods. Just as I'm sure your parents would tell you when they're trying to get you to eat vegetables, these foods are very nutritious. They are high in calories. So you don't need to eat that many of them in order to get full or to have the energy that you need to go about with a day's worth of work. And whenever these crops get shared with Europeans, that's going to have a huge effect on European populations. But this is how native societies were able to sustain themselves. Those that practice agriculture would plant some combination of corn, squash, beans, and even potatoes. So potatoes are another high caloric food that grows plentifully in a very small amount of space. So continuing on in this key concept, we're going to see that some native populations went even further in their use of agriculture to the point that they were adapting to the environment, they were changing their environment in order to be able to continue to feed more and more people. So here you have three different civilizations that were in Mesoamerica, South America, and Central America. At the very top, you have the city or a model of the city of Tenochtitlan. This was the capital city of the Aztecs, which was located in central Mexico in modern day Mexico City. So their changing of the environment was by leveling out a marshy land in the middle of a lake, and that's where they built their capital city. And because they were in the middle of a lake, they were able to build irrigation channels that would continue to provide water for their crops. On the bottom left, you see the city of Machu Picchu. It was up in the mountains, so living in the mountains is going to require a lot of environmental modification in order to adapt. And then on the bottom right, you have the Mayan capital city of Tikal. So anytime in which you have civilizations that are building these very heavy temples and stone structures, that means that they're going to be there for a long time. No one builds a huge temple and then walks away and migrates to another area. That's very uncommon because you're putting a lot of effort into it. So these civilizations were sedentary, and in order to feed these sedentary populations, you had to have a lot of food. And so the building was always coupled with some form of infrastructure project that allowed these civilizations to feed their people. So the next key concept deals with exchange. So that's contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans resulted in the Colombian Exchange and significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So Colombian Exchange, sometimes you'll see it as triangular trade because as you see, it connects Europe, Africa, and North and South America. The things that were being traded or exchanged through this Colombian exchange included crops, diseases, livestock, coerced labor, human chattel was another thing that was coming from Africa to North America. And so the effects on every part of the Colombian exchange were great. It cost, massive amounts of change for the people that came in contact with these new goods, diseases, and forms of labor. So as you can see, in North America was sending squash, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, turkeys, peanuts, potatoes, all these foodstuffs that were going to Europe that were, again, high in calories, very nutritious, and were able to grow plentifully in a small amount of space. And that's going to create one of the first social changes in Europe, which is more people are going to be able to live longer, which will lead to a scarcity of land. One of the most important things that was being brought from the old world, Europe and Africa, to North America, the new world, were diseases. So you see the list here: smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. These were all diseases that the people that were living in the new world had no immunities for, which meant that once they came into contact with that disease and they got sick, then it was a high chance that not only were they going to die, but they may also spread it very easily to the people living around them, which led to a decimation of the New World population. So those estimated 54 million people that were living before 1492 in that territory are going to go down to a very small fraction. And you also see that there are some crops that are coming from the old world going into the new world. One of the most important ones that's going from the old world to the new world is sugarcane, because sugarcane is a luxury item in Europe at this time. It costs a lot of money because it's hard to acquire. Sugarcane only grows in certain areas, and then once you're able to grow it, it takes a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of labor to extract the actual sugar morsels from the sugar cane. And so, because the Caribbean had that very warm tropical climate that was conducive to growing a lot of sugar cane, that was something that was established all through the Caribbean and then later through South America. So the political changes that were brought about by the Colombian Exchange were some regime changes. So the first one was the Aztec Empire being toppled by the Spanish conquistadors. So in this picture in the top left, you see Hernan Cortes, the leader of the conquistadors that had been given permission by the Spanish crown to go out and conquer, bring back goods, bring back gold, and claim any new territory or land for the king and queen of Spain. At first, Hernan Cortes had a difficult time in trying to conquer the Aztec Empire because, like I said, they had their capital city at the center of a lake, so it was difficult to access. And even if the Spanish tried to besiege the city was self-sufficient. They had food that they could grow within the city walls, and so that was difficult. Cortes had to acquire the help of rival tribes and rival groups of the Aztecs, and a translator who is named Malinche. She's right here in this image, introducing Cortes to Moctezuma, because Moctezuma, the leader of the Aztecs, eventually let Cortes in, thinking that his arrival had been the fulfillment of an Aztec prophecy. He genuinely believed that the Spanish were Aztec gods, that Hernan Cortes himself was the god Quetzalcoatl. And then the other large empire that fell during this time was the Inca Empire, and that attack was led by Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro, um, and he conquered the Incas. The last Inca leader is here on the top right. His name is Atahualpa. He is eventually killed by the conquistadors, but before he is killed, he um, converts to Catholicism because when he was going to be executed, they were going to burn his body. And because he didn't want his body to be burnt, he agreed to switch over to Catholicism so that his body would remain intact after his death. All right, so the next key concept here is 1.2 Roman numeral 1. It says European expansion into the Western Hemisphere generated intense social, religious, political, and economic competition and changes within European society. So up to this point, we really just talked about the Spanish going out into the New World and exploring and conquering and getting gold and spreading Christianity. And so the success of the Spanish in the New World is going to be seen by its European rivals as something that they want as well. The Portuguese had been very successful in doing exploring in Asia and going around the tip of Africa. But now that the proof of concept of going out to the New World had been proven by the Spanish, the Portuguese also wanted to go out and explore the New World. The problem was that both the Spanish and the Portuguese were patrons of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church did not want them fighting over land and territory, because then the Catholic Church would probably get a lot less money and support from these two countries. So the Pope brokered a deal between the two, and that deal was called the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. They set a line of longitude that basically split up the world into one side was the side in which the Spanish were free to go out, explore, and conquer, and then the other side was the other part of the world that the Portuguese were allowed to go out and conquer. So that relegated the Portuguese mostly to the Eastern Hemisphere. But as you can see on the map there, you have a tiny little sliver of South America, which is where we have modern day Brazil. So here you have King John II of Portugal and King Ferdinand of Spain signing the treaty. And as I said before, really Brazil becomes the only New World piece of territory that the Portuguese are able to acquire. So the next key concept here, we're still talking about the effects of the Colombian Exchange. It says the Colombian Exchange and the development of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere resulted in extensive demographic, economic, and social changes. So we've already touched upon the demographic change. That's anything that has to do with people. So the New World crops increased the Old World populations. A lot of people were now able to eat potatoes, corn, and they were able to plant them in their small plots of land. And so people lived longer, and as they lived longer, they were able to have more kids. And as their kids had more kids, now you had a surplus of population in Europe. That means that you have more people than land that they can live on. And this is going to fuel further New World exploration because as people want to improve their situation and want upward mobility, they're going to go to the places that have the thing that they were searching for. And in this case, it was land or money. The gold that came from the New World also helped lay the foundations of the banking system. So this is some of the economic effects of the Colombian Exchange. The Spanish conquistadors saw that some of the native groups that they came into contact with were wearing some jewelry that consisted of gold. And so eventually they found gold mines in South America, they found silver mines in Mexico, and they started to extract this gold usually through coerced labor of Native Americans, and sending it back to Spain. And so using money, actual coins, and depositing into banks is going to start the momentum to establish a capitalist system in Europe. It's not going to happen immediately, it's not going to be overnight, but we're going to see a shift from feudalism to capitalism, and really that begins with the mineral wealth that the Spanish were able to find in the New World. Continuing on, the next key concept says that in their interactions, Europeans and Native Americans asserted divergent worldviews regarding issues such as religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. And so this essentially says that the Europeans and the Native groups in North and South America were vastly different, which is logical, but we want to make sure that we kind of hit upon some of the specific things that they really had in difference with each other. So the first one was the use of land. And so native groups in North America, they really didn't have a desire to aggressively change their landscapes. Some believe that nature held spiritual properties. So they did use the land. Like I said, they planted foods, they practiced agriculture, but in some areas, they would forage, they would get food from forest. This was especially true in areas like in the Pacific Coast in Northern California, also in the Northeast, like the Iroquois in the forests up in the Northeast along the Appalachian Ranges. They would go into the forest, they would hunt, they would gather, and the ways in which they would interact with their environment there is that sometimes they would encourage forest growth through managed fires. And so that's what this picture is here in the top left. So especially in the forest in California, fire encourages growth of large trees, and it also clears the floor of the forest, which makes it more accessible for people to walk through and to hunt. On the top right here, you have cave dwellings by the Anasazi people in Mesa Verde, Colorado. You also have some cave dwellings in New Mexico. And you have other native groups like in Pueblo, New Mexico, and Taos, New Mexico. They had similar structures like this, and so they're really adapting to their environment. They're not really looking to change it quite as much. The groups that really did change their environment, and a good example of that would be here in the Aztecs. This is the capital city of Tenochtitlan in the middle of Lake Texcoco. So even this adaptation of environment by the Aztecs is not quite as extreme as what's going to be seen with Europeans. So as soon as the Spanish begin to expand their New World Empire, they're going to start building cathedrals and churches everywhere, stone buildings. They will start building universities. And so these are the ways in which they differed in the way in which they used their environment. So that's land use. In terms of uh, gender roles, we'll see that some native groups, especially like the Iroquois in the Northeast, they are going to organize themselves along matrilineal lines. That means that they are going to follow the lineage of the females of the mothers in the family. And Europeans, they really just wanted to extract as much as they could from the land. So they wanted the gold that they found and send it back to Spain. Some of their other motivations was to spread Christianity. So that's the God part of gold, God and glory. And of course, glory meant that they wanted to conquer the people who were in the New World. The conquistadors that would go out there to uh, be the main fighting force, they were looking to gain nobility titles or even just land in the New World so that they could have upward mobility. And then in terms of religion, they also differed in that the Native Americans were not Christian. That was really the biggest difference for them. There was a wide, diverse amount of religions in the New World, uh, almost as diverse as the language groups that had developed, but in the eyes of the Europeans, in the eyes of the Spanish, it didn't matter the difference between the religious views that they held, because in the end, they were not Christian, and that was all that really mattered to the Europeans. So the Europeans, they were coming from a patriarchal system, a Christian society that were vastly, vastly different than the Native Americans. So as a quick recap, the natives migrated across the land bridge to create a diverse continent of people. Each was unique in their use of the environment and its social structures. Um, the Colombian Exchange brought about massive change for all involved, and European expansion brought about social, economic, and political changes in Europe. And so these are all the things that we're going to keep in mind as we go into the next set of lectures for all of period one. And so that is it for today, and I will see you guys on the next one.